All right, thank you. Calling upon Prime Minister. Here.
Awesome. Can I verify that everyone can hear me?
Yep.
Cool. POS in the chat, please. I will hopefully take closing around 5. If closings don't have any, I'll take opening. Is anybody not ready? Cool. Really simple case from OG. In the status quo, there's a race to the bottom where the poorest countries with the weakest labor protections are mining rare earth minerals in incredibly unethical ways, killing their workers and poisoning their populations. This is horrible. We think we can solve this. Let's talk about our model. 4 points to this. One, we think this work roughly like the IMF, i.e., every country is in the organization of a voting share based on their amount of monetary buy-in. This means that countries with disproportionate amount of capital invested in the industry will have disproportionate power. This is important because even if the industry is often voted in countries like, say, Kazakhstan, the investors are often in places like the US or China or Russia, or places that generally are more developed and have more capital. Second, there will be neutral leadership, i.e., there will be a tacit agreement, much like the IMF, that neither China nor the US nor Russia can be the ones in charge of it, and someone like Switzerland would usually have the presidency or other important roles. Third, there'll be a very clear mission statement, which is to make sure that the amount that's mined is going to be a reasonable amount, not too high nor too low, and that it is done ethically. I.e., their goal is to control not just how much is extracted and putting both a ceiling and a floor so that you can't do too much price shenanigans, but also to control the method you use to remove the rare earth minerals. And fourth, they will have some level of coercive power, i.e., the organization will have the ability to say, we do not like how you're mining it, and then demand other countries that don't buy it. Obviously, they won't be able to enforce this, but hopefully they'll be able to say China, US don't buy, for example, Congolese rare earth minerals for this, and this reason, much like how the UN can issue these kind of opinions. Now, two pieces of framing. Number one, rare earth minerals are, of course, rare. They only exist in places that, one, have old growth mountains, i.e., these are mountains that are literally almost a billion years old. And, as a fact claim, we understand them mostly in places like Central Asia, South Central Africa, the US, and China. This is where most of the deposits are. If you want a structural reason for this, we know these are highly profitable, but also really hard to mine because they're hard on workers. So they only get mined in places that both have low labor protections and want to make money by doing so. Obviously, if the things wasn't true, we'd see it being mined in more places. Second piece of framing. The US and China would obviously like to mine these things because one, you can make a lot of money, and two, it's really important for things like their semiconductor industries, which they care a lot about for strategic reasons. But neither of them are doing this right now because they don't want to be the first to do it for a couple of reasons. One, sustainability. They know if they start mining it first, they'll run out first. You will not run out in the immediate future, but they're worried about, say, 200 years down the line. And second, there's a soft power issue. Even if the actual running out doesn't matter, looking like you blink first looks bad and signals weak leadership, so they somewhat irrationally don't want to mine first. And finally, third, it's hard to compete. There's a race to the bottom. You can't in the US and China, there are actual environmental regulations. It's hard to compete with, say, like Congo or Kazakhstan, which is willing to poison their population as they're being sold in the same market, despite being mined with different environmental regulations. But I think it was coordinated and more regulated. The US and China be willing to start mining, which we think is good. This brings us to our main piece of positive matter. This makes mining way more ethical by increasing labor standards and increasing environmental standards. Note, I want to note that rare earth minerals are highly toxic. This is, of course, a fact I think the average reasonable voter knows, but if you need reasons for this, number one, they tend to be heavy minerals, i.e., these are deep on the periodic table, means they are hard to break down. Second, they usually are magnetic, so they have unexpected effects on, say, protein folding in your body, so single ones can fuck up lots of proteins, especially near neurons. And third, no, these don't occur much in nature. They only occur deep in the ground because they're so heavy. They tend to sink when the earth was still molten, so they're deep in there, which means they don't occur that much in nature. So bodies haven't evolved ways to filter them out with things like kidneys, which they have for things like lighter minerals. Now, the other consequence of this is we're so deep in the earth, the cheapest way to mine them is pit mining, which is where you take a giant hose and pressure blast a fuck ton of water, get a fuck ton of truck, they get a really fucking deep pit, and you filter all the water as it runs off to get the minerals out. This is the cheapest way to do it. Anything else would involve building really deep mining staff where things get really, heavy. And if you're, for example, using filters, actually going through it manually, this would be way more expensive. The problem with this is you have a lot of water runoff that's filled with a lot of minerals that you decide you didn't want. Because remember, 99% of that dirt is useless as far as you're concerned, but is where mineral deposits happen to be, so still is full of other heavy minerals or rare earth minerals that you failed to catch. And it's expensive to do this well. The consequence is this is only done in countries with bad labor standards and bad environmental standards, where they're okay with runoff running into the groundwater, which goes into their rivers, that goes into their rain, that goes into their people's bodies, and places with low labor standards where they're okay with workers getting jobs where they aren't paid that well and are going to be inheriting minerals that are going to be doing things like giving them cancer. And what's the impact of this? Pretty straightforward. The people who are working are being overwhelmingly bad treated. This often looks like, especially child labor in the Congo. Like, oh, you're smaller, we'll go into the mine. And it means the environment goes to shit, which is everyone who lives even remotely around the pit mine, which is pretty bad. Now, we can solve this regulation. Note, the countries with lots of capital in this organization are going to want to do this for two reasons. One, they want to mine their own rare earth minerals, but they can't do it if the other countries are doing it really cheaply. So they want strong environmental regulations to make it more expensive for the other countries so they can compete without getting rid of their own regulations. And two, to be frank, they're not evil. The US, China, Russia all understand this is really unethical and would rather this not get done, all things held equal. I'll take OO.
Yeah, this is a sports motion. Why on earth would China allow any kind of meaningful leadership in Turkey?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a lot of reasons to buy into this. Number one, I think there's a lot of you make money by doing this, right? You would start mining rare earth minerals where you otherwise wouldn't. Now, note, I think these regulations work. Three reasons. One's a pretty good incentive structure. If the organization says, don't buy minerals from Kazakhstan, the US and China and Russia all want to buy into this. This enables them to mine their own minerals. Well, if any of them breaks the line, suddenly it's a race to the bottom. Now none of them can sell them. They all want to stay in. Second, you probably provide resources to more developing countries to make sure they're doing it relatively ethically, which makes it better, including, like, say, intellectual resources, like saying, here's how you run your mines better. And third, it just avoids race to the bottom. Remember, as long as the US, Russia, and China, the main buyers are coordinated, this is sufficient to bully the rest of the market into place. But additionally, I think this shrinks the rare earth minerals industry in developing countries. That's simply because now it's one, more expensive to do it, so there's less profit, and two, they're now competing with, say, the US or China, who often can do it better and easier in a lot of ways, because they have more intensive capital markets and more access to better machinery. This is good because it frees up labor and capital in those countries to be used on things like human capital, education, or better industries like retail that leave your country growing without poisoning your population. And two, it stops you funneling money into things that are based on who owns the land. Remember, who owns the land in Congo, Kazakhstan, is mostly a result of things like colonialism and who happened to take over the land by force at a previous point in time. So generally owned by oligarchs, not the regular people, and the governments are often highly corrupt. So all the money from this is being channeled to oligarchs. So to the extent these things are profitable, it's not good for regular people in Kazakhstan. So when you make this weaker, you mean people are probably doing better industries on net, which is good. Hard to propose.
Thank you for that speech. Calling upon leaders of opposition. Here.
Yeah, just let me sort through my stuff. I prefer POIs in, I prefer POIs in chat. Please don't interrupt my speech, and I'll hopefully take at around 5, preferably from closing. Okay, start my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Before I begin with my rebuttals and my argument about how this is how likely this is going to be under China's control and it's going to be bad, I just would like to point out some meta-analysis, right? I think this house supports motion, so clearly OG needs to argue the likelihood of the mechanization in the world happening, i.e., why would there probably be a neutral leadership and then that China or the US wouldn't fight for dominance in that international body? Because I posit that China has an incentive to never let this happen for a few reasons. And the comparative instead is that I would see OG's model being more like OPEC, for example, where Saudi Arabia produces 70% of the world's oil. Therefore, they're able to have that kind of leverage and control over that kind of international body, and they're able to regulate a lot of stuff within that body as well. But China will probably enact some sort of leverage and control by enacting their leverage as being currently the world's largest producer of REEs, rare earth minerals, right? And just exporting it to Taiwan so they can make semiconductors. But even if China doesn't have direct control over the body, I argue instead that China has an incentive to indirectly control the body instead through things like sales or regulations or even policy about how countries are able to trade with each other regarding REEs, or how countries are able to mine these things whatever that benefits China, right? Because logically, China does want to benefit from this. They are the world's largest producer of REEs. Therefore, they want to be able to exploit and capitalize upon this I'll take you later, upon this opportunity to be able to like expand into a new market and potentially gain a lot of like financial capital in this case for it, right? They want to employ their power over this body, right? So the first thing that OG points out is that, oh, you will give resources to more developing countries, and these are going to be like intellectual resources to make sure that like these developing countries especially are not going to like misuse like going to simply do the mining or like make sure that mining is done ethically. I think this is bad in this case where China now holds leverage over these countries, where in the case where the international body is controlled indirectly even by China, that these countries are obtaining some sort of benefit from China. I think that the leverage that China holds in this case is going to become quite unhelpful to these countries, which I'll explain into my argument, right? So my first argument is how bilateral trade, the comparative under opposition, is much more better than having an international body. Why? I think firstly, a very obvious point is that when countries are able to trade freely with each other, when countries are able to pick and choose what kind of countries like the China, US was also producing REEs, but a much lesser extent, as to which country I want to trade with when it comes to REEs, I think then countries are also then able to specialize in certain industries. They're able to invest in maybe their local industries even more on the opposition side of the house, and they're able to improve the ability to export and import and have efficiency among economies. But secondly, and more importantly, I think that countries who are under opposition, who have the ability and capacity to enact bilateral trade instead of being part of this international body, is that they will have alternatives if China messes up or China somehow gets itself into a political turmoil or whatever that happens within China as a whole that will like affect how the rate of efficiency they will produce at REs. That means countries, for example, have maybe like countries like the US to fall back on. It reduces China's control in the semiconductor industry, or at least it creates a very good limit on China's control, right? It creates like a limit as to how much China is able to control the semiconductor industry or the REs as a whole. I think it's important for own countries, especially developing countries who are wanting to be a part of the semiconductor industry, and let's say who are like comparatively less advantaged or like less capacity, like Malaysia, for example, compared to like countries like the US or China, for example, right? And it's also important then for individual countries to be able to have backups and safety nets for themselves in case of any emergency that occurs from these countries that will undeniably affect them in some way or shape or form because they're that dependent on them, right? By allowing this, by having like a bilateral trade and not an international body, we allow these countries, especially developing countries, to be able to expand their choices and to be able to actually have safety nets for themselves and not fall prey to certain things that would probably inevitably happen to certain countries. The second argument then is how it damages the environment, right? Because I know that OG posits that it will be done more ethically and stuff like that, but only given my analysis on the top of how China will indirectly control the body at the end of the day and how this is bad, I don't think that mining is going to be that ethical in certain aspects, but and this is bad for a few reasons, right? Because there's long-term impacts and short-term impacts. You are not going to be able to grow properly grow certain crops at the end of the day. This is even bad for developing countries because because a lot of these countries like Laos, for example, are very dependent on agricultural countries or agricultural industries, which means that when the soil is eroded and stuff like that, they are directly affected by this. And secondly, I will posit that China doesn't really in this body or in this institution as a whole will have the incentive to, okay, sure, maybe they'll provide intellectual resources and they'll do certain checks and balances, but I don't think it'll be to the extent that will be that beneficial to them at the end of the day. That will be that beneficial to the environment, because at the end of the day, what China does want, and with the main incentive of it, is that they want to be able to profit from this industry or profit from this international body as soon as possible in the best way possible. And they're able to profit in the most short-term way possible, I would say, because in order to expand their influence or their power in certain cases through this international body. So I don't think that even if China provides help, it's going to be that beneficial or even helpful to these countries as a whole, right? So what have we given you? I think we're giving you two things. One, about how China is going to most likely control the international body and why it is bad, and it directly leads to how bilateral trade under opposition intent becomes better, or at least bilateral trade is a better choice compared to the international body. And secondly, how like directly rebutting to OG's claim about how like this mining will be done ethically because there'll be resources given to developing countries. I don't think this will happen. And at the end of the day, this is going to damage the environment to a large extent. But if not, to an extent, that will affect local industries or countries who are dependent on like soil and agriculture as a whole. With that, never been proud to oppose. Thanks.
Thank you for that speech. Calling upon Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Can I do POIs in the chat? As open government, the crux of our case is that rare earth element mining is so ridiculously bad for both the environment and the population surrounding those mines that any attempt at regulation is going to be better than the status quo. I don't think that opening opposition provides any method for solvency to the obvious harms that are occurring right now. I want to talk about two things in this speech. First, I want to talk about China, and then I want to talk about mine safety. First, let's talk about China. I think opening government provides this case that, oh, China is going to like control this international body, and then they're going to do all these things such as like controlling all of the trade of the rare earth elements in the world. First of all, deeply unlikely scenario and quite uncharitable, but let's give them their best case. One, moving all rare earth mineral mining to China is actually probably good. This is because China is a relatively developed nation compared to the other countries which are doing rare earth element mining in the status quo. They have relatively strong environmental protections for two reasons. One, because they need it for soft power, because they want to present themselves as a developed nation, because at one point in time they had the largest emissions in the world, and that was extremely bad for their ability to trade with other nations. And so they've done a lot of work in order to improve themselves on that. Secondly, because they have a relatively educated population that demands certain types of protections onto themselves and their workers, i.e. people in China have a relatively larger amount of power than people in the Congo to be able to advocate for their own protections if they ever to be able to go into the mine, because there's like more industries in China, and so there's more opportunities for you to go into different types of work if a certain type of company is exploiting you. This means that if, for example, the United States or the entire rest of the world is buying all of their elements from only China, this is still going to be better than the status quo, because this means that the worst of the worst violations of open pit mining, water runoff, clearly the entire population's water supplies is not going to be occurring, because this is not a thing that occurs in China because the population would fundamentally riot. This means that even if China creates a monopoly on all rare earth elements, this is still going to be good for our case. Secondly, leverage goes both ways, because I think the opening government's main argument here is that China will have too much leverage over the other countries because they will have all of the minerals. First of all, that's not going to happen because the other countries still have the elements in the ground, so why would they let China have so much leverage over them? But secondly, even if it is true that there's going to be significantly increased trade between, say, for example, the United States and China, this is good, because the reason why a war between the US and China is fundamentally impossible to conceive of is because their economies are so intertwined. To the extent that you increase trade between the two nations, you actually decrease the likelihood of conflict, because now China is reliant on money coming in from the United States to feed their population and to allow themselves to be economically stable. This means this is really important because in the status quo, both China and the US are pulling away, i.e. you're stopping semiconductor trade and all the other trade wars that are occurring. If you create an international organization that is going to regulate this trade, and to the extent that opening opposition is correct, that there's now going to be increased trade out of China and out of China and into the United States, this is probably going to create more dependencies between their economies, which lowers the likelihood of conflict. And also, bilateral trade doesn't work. One, because it fundamentally creates the problem that exists in the status quo, where countries with less environmental regulations and less oversight are going to undercut other countries with their worst practices, which means that the only minerals that are being extracted and are being bought are going to be those that are being extracted in the worst possible way. But secondly, even if China has problems, I think one, obviously people are going to create backup plans for how they're going to get access to their important minerals to the extent that these things are actually important to them. Obviously, countries are not stupid. They're not going to have only China as their only source to the extent that these elements exist in the ground in other places, it's going to be fine. But secondly, I just don't think that opening opposition proves that these rare earth elements are actually like particularly mission critical to the vast majority of countries. I.e., one, you already have like reasonably large stockpiles to the extent that you're doing something that is mission critical, like going to the moon or something like that. But secondly, these are things that are being used in emerging technologies, which means that they're just not that important for the basic industries of the mass majority of these countries. We're talking about things like electric cars, not things like being able to provide electricity to people. All right, but I do think this is probably an internationally neutral group. Why? First, because of precedence, as we tell you, this is just how regulatory groups work in the status quo. For example, the IMF, which means this is the thing that countries are likely to come up with in the first place and then buy into because they've already bought into it in the past. But secondly, because US buy-in and Russian buy-in and European buy-in is necessary, i.e. in this motion, we have to assume this is something that is going to happen. To the extent that this happens, do you really think that every other country is in the world which has these elements in their land, like in their own earth, is going to just roll over and let China just take over them and their complete economic control? That's just unlikely to happen. That's why an international coalition and a neutral group is probably most likely. I'll take CO.
Your logic seems to insinuate that most of these major trade powers are likely to end in a back and forth tussle and basically leave this organization in a stalemate, and which basically leads to no progress in these sectors.
No, that's why you need an international organization to mandate the amount that each country is, for example, allowed to mine, the way that they're allowed to mine it, and how much trade occurs, right? You need to make sure someone steps into the middle, so make sure that no one fucks each other over to increase the amount of trust that they're actually able to trade with one another. This is why without any regulation, the US and China is unlikely to do trade with each other because they're worried about like losing that trust. But you have someone in the middle, then you have a trustworthy body that he can do deals with. Regardless, China wants to push for environmental regulations because it makes their own industries more profitable. They do not want to be undercut by African nations who are mining these things in more environmentally harmful ways. I don't care if rare earth element supplies stop. This is the way. What matters more is that we are causing permanent pollution and harm onto individuals, permanent extinction of entire species of animals, and excess consumption of technologies, which leads to the fundamental death of people who are in situations where they are being exploited. That probably matters significantly more than whether or not people have access to rare earth minerals. Let's talk about mine safety. I think far too often we focus our sights on the new and impressive technology without truly considering how that technology is produced and its impact on the world that we live in. We rush to buy new electric cars, but in the process, we create more carbon than if we had just driven our own gas cars for 10 more years. Technology is an ever-growing market where people funnel huge amounts of money into products with convoluted supply chains and multinational origins. These products are being created by the ones who can produce them the cheapest, and in that process, the world is irreversibly harmed. The most common way this happens for rare earth elements is open pit mining, using child labor. That means huge holes dug into the ground by children because they are smaller and lighter. They dig these holes in places with little regulation or weak oversight. These pits are literally chunks taken out of the land, destroying habitats for keystone species, causing things like famine and diseases to spawn. The water runoff cannot be controlled because the pits are so big, and so chemicals leak into the water supply, causing cancer and unrelated populations that don't even work in the mines. One, climate change is irreversible. We're reaching the point of irreversibility. The more open pit mining we do, the more likely we are to all go extinct. Two, the loss of lives of these individuals who are being exploited in these countries cannot be reversed and cannot be understated. This is not the only way to mine. This is why regulation works, because there are other methods. Open pit mining is illegal in developed nations like the United States or environmentally conscious nations like China. You can control water runoff. You do not have to use children. Two ways our plan increases mine safety. One, we change where that mining occurs. US and China both want to mine domestically, but they are stuck in a stalemate where neither can be the first one to start. That's why you need an international body to regulate when they start and how much they start. And secondly, we regulate the places that are mining in the first place, which means that even if it is true that we do not provide funding to these countries, even if we are only to provide guidance, what we can do is we can share information on the best ways to control mining in such a way that is environmentally conscious. That in itself is an impact that's important.
Thank you for that speech. Calling upon DLO.
All right, great. You guys in chat. I'll try to take closing. The first thing I want to discuss is what this body is likely to look like. Because this is a support motion, so OG has to argue the likelihood of the body ending up this way. So the model of like IMF is very unlikely to happen because the IMF was created as part of the Bretton Woods Agreement back when the US was the sole global superpower. In a bipolar world now between the US and China, or I guess the US, the West and China, it is very unlikely that China just lets the US or lets the world create a body that is neutral in leadership, has fair governance structure to do things that will hurt their own economy. security and their own strategic interests. It is very unlikely that this is going to happen in this way. We say it's much more likely to be like OPEC, because Saudi controls OPEC, even though there's like a facade of democracy inside there, because Saudi produces 70% of the global supply of oil. So if anyone in OPEC disagrees with Saudi, Saudi just turns the tap off. And they have done it before, by the way, to jack the prices of oil up. And because the entire world was dependent on oil as a source of energy, it effectively gives Saudi complete control over OPEC and the rest of the world energy supply as well. We explain very clear incentive for China to control the market. We explain that they produce 70% of the world rare earth extraction. They can cut supply to threaten supply chains everywhere around the world. And it's just untrue to say that the world does not depend on semiconductors or rare earth. And semiconductors are used in every single electronic with the transistors on anything that has a circuit board, the laptop that you are using, the telephone that you are using, the webcam that I am using, anything that creates your entire mobile internet, the telecommunication infrastructure all around the world, all of that depends on semiconductor. And it's not just about the creation of it, it's also about the maintenance and about continued production and expansion into different places. Semiconductors drive the world today, and that is why the world cannot live without rare earth extraction. This gives China unprecedented power through this international body. Right? With the rise of AI and stuff, it is just very unclear why nations have stockpile. Right? There's so many things that depend on semiconductors. I think this is very, very unlikely. I just want to observe as well that in terms of incentive structures from opening Gov on why China wouldn't do this, note that OG doesn't really give you any structural analysis, any incentive, any evidence of what China has done before. Because they say China has an incentive to do this because they're very environmentally friendly, because of soft power, because they were big emitters in the past. Nowhere in this line of analysis does it demonstrate an inclination for China to continue to do so in this specific circumstance, given the very clear economic incentives that we identify in opening opposition as to why rare earth extraction is such a big part of China's economy and the world's global supply chain today. I would posit that even if it is true that China wants soft power, that China wants to reduce its carbon footprint, China is more likely to prioritize its economic security and its strategic interest, especially in like this geopolitical struggle with the West, and therefore control the body in a way that does not enforce regulation in the way that opening government desires. Even if China doesn't do this, the perception is that they will, which affects the willingness of other nations to opt into this body and to also abide by the regulation that this body sets. So these smaller developing nations are probably less likely to want to join this body in the first place because they perceive it as a threat to their own economic security. And at least they're not part of this body, they can still engage in bilateral trades in rare earth extractions with other countries who are also not part of the body, the same way there's other countries that are not part of the ICC, that just kind of do their own thing. All of this goes to show that the body is unlikely to be set up in a way that is good, unlikely to have proper governance structures that can hold China in check, unlikely to have regional and international support to buy in and force the recommendations and all the regulations that open government want in this debate, because of the fact that China controls so much of the rare earth extraction supply, and they just do not have the incentive to be benevolent when it comes to their own self-interest. So what happens as an outcome? Of the regulations that OG wants are just very unlikely to materialize, given that China is facing a declining economy since COVID and they want to boost economic production to match with the US. It is very unlikely that they will impose labor regulation and environmental regulation because by OG's own analysis, this is really, really expensive, right? OG says that they produce a lot of EVs and there's a lot of spending on green tech, which is true, but green extraction for these rare earths is extremely costly, which is why they're not likely to do it. EVs are an economic export. They can earn money by producing and exporting EVs and to some extent solar panels as well. But green extraction of rare earths, by OG's own analysis, is much, much more expensive and therefore very unlikely to happen. When it comes to labor regulation, I have no idea. Since when China has been good in protecting laborers, China is notorious for exploiting workers that do not have education because the entire system is a command structure from the top down, right? So you got protesters in Tiananmen, they get shot. You get dissenters, they get locked up because China doesn't want to be transparent at all. It is deeply unclear to me why China has any incentive to do any of the benevolent things that the Gov bench wants in this debate. Even if, in the best case of Gov, that China enforces some kind of regulation, I think these regulations are likely to be very unequally enforced because the China enforcing ethical standards on their competitors while keeping regulators out of their own country. So if places like Kazakhstan want to mine rare earths, and I don't know why Kazakhstan does rare earth production, or places in Africa want to do this, then China through this body will say, you must be sustainable, you must do this very sustainable like mining techniques, even though it's really expensive. Maybe they'll help them. I don't think this is likely. But what it just shows to show is that China uses this as a means to control the global supply chain, the global semiconductor supply chain, and that's terrible. It's the same way the US refuses to ratify the Rome Statute or listen to ICJ rulings of Gaza, the same way Iran refused to let international regulators come and look at their nuclear facilities to check that they're complying with like whatever. All of these things show that these kind of regulations will be unequally enforced because of the disproportionate amount of power that China has when it comes to producing rare earths. Anything from CG? Nope. All right, OG, go for it.
Sure, the US has a lot of rare earth minerals too. And China does everything you say, the US will also leave. So China won't do this because they want to cooperate so they make more money.
I thought you want the US in the body as well. So if China does all this and then the US leaves the body, then you have a body. So like I really don't know where this is going. If it's true that the China and US are not on very friendly terms, then it's very unlikely you get the international cooperation that you want. Okay, what then is the best way to regulate the extraction and trade of rare earths? We said in first that counterfactual was better to have things like bilateral trade, which allows nations to go to other countries if China tries to go and make problems for them. So if China tries to set global standards for like sustainable mining and then they don't follow it themselves, then other countries don't have to trade with China. Like the OG just pointed out, US also produces a bit. China still produces the most, of course, and some nations will have to control. But with bilateral trade, it allows nations not to be controlled by China through this international body. What about the environment and all that problems? One, OG doesn't solve it for all the reasons that I talked about. But secondly, I think we see natural trends of things becoming more sustainable. So as the cost of brownfield mining goes up, sustainable techniques become cheaper. The same way Russian oil crisis led to investment in renewables, brownfield development is a thing as well. So even if it's bad for people right now, governments are responding and they're trying to become more sustainable. And I think this body just makes it unlikely to get better. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. With that, conclude the opening half, calling upon members of government.
Amazing. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
So yesterday it was 45 degrees with the humidity in Shanghai, and I can only imagine how miserable it must have been if I was one of the people I saw having to work outside. For these people, and for tons of other people in the world, climate change is an existential threat. I mean, we hear this all the time, but I want to clarify what this means. Complete destruction of all life on Earth. Obviously, this is quite important. And what we're going to do from Closing Government is thoroughly explain why this international body would, one, likely surmounting the push from opening opposition, and two, effectively improve the development of a lot of green technologies which are going to allow for an energy transition, which actually help ramify and improve the problem of climate change. First point here on framing. Obviously, states disagree on many partial things, right? They may disagree, I think, on certain things about like labor regulations. They may disagree on some things, but obviously climate change affects both people in China and people in America and everybody in between. So I think an international body, as I think you can see the UN, who is fairly concerned about this as well, all are likely to come to certain agreements about accomplishing goals. And so if such a thing came into existence, I think one likely priority would be certain elements of supply controls and certain elements of ensuring that rare earth minerals go to certain places in order to produce green technology the most efficiently. I think this is extremely likely because right, we fiat and assume that this international body comes into existence. And so then we have to ask ourselves what the thing in which all of the relevant actors who are going to come to create it can agree on the most, right? A lot of them have different views about how much they're willing to exploit other countries. Obviously, some of them don't care about buying from child labor. I mean, I guess that's actually everybody. Everybody buys from child labor. But everyone is equivalently affected, and I think more affected than anything else selfishly by the effects of climate change. So I think this is probably the number one item on the docket for the states coming to create this type of body. The first mechanism here on how I think we can effectively produce better green technology and facilitate this transition faster and more effectively is that a ton of rare earth minerals and a ton of the products of rare earth minerals go to inefficient and just not important industries. Right? Right now, like Nvidia is one of the top companies in the world, and they produce a lot of very important things, but they also produce lots of stuff that goes into video gaming PCs and other types of like for fun technologies, stuff like cryptocurrency mining, which listen, I mean, is fun, but is probably not super important, right? So this international body, I think, could effectively price gouge people buying it for this purpose and ensure that critical industries like BYD and Tesla, who are just right down the road from me, can produce electric vehicles and sell them for cheaper in places that otherwise wouldn't be able to afford them, right? So developing world countries, they can bring those costs down because they're generating an effective supply of rare earth minerals, which otherwise they would have to compete with these incredibly high money for fun type luxury industries who can obviously outcompete them on price, because the point is not to sell energy products to poor people or vehicle products to poor people that are green, it's to sell fun things to rich people. So we can solve that problem by limiting the amount of supply which go to these luxury industries and ensuring they go towards producing the things humanity needs to not immediately die from the climate crisis. The second mechanism here is that there are a substantial amount of OPEC-style blocks that already exist. There's one in South America, which includes Bolivia and Argentina, for instance, who are already price gouging in trade with other countries. And so China and Bolivia can sort of work together regionally to price gouge the relevant actors trying to buy these companies who are using them to produce solar panels and these kinds of things by artificially raising the price. So I think if you consider how, if you think about the dynamics of how these states are already coming together to work, it's obvious that there's some regional price gouging already going on. The only way I think you can solve that is by internationalizing the system, because everybody is likely to agree on the specific industries that matter, and we can price gouge the ones that don't. But thirdly, I think this international body can create more fluid and efficient supply chains overall, right? So now companies that produce the parts which are necessary to create perhaps future sort of climate reduction technologies or ways to make sandy regions that used to be able to produce agriculture but can't in order to make them more arable so you can produce stuff, right? There's lots of specific parts that are necessary for this. Companies can now ensure that they have a 20 or 50-year supply window from this international body, who's the only actor who could make such a guarantee to provide them with the minerals to produce said parts. Similarly, like solar panel manufacturers and electric car manufacturers can ensure that they will have a steady supply of REMs moving forward and can lock in that into their funding, into their sort of payment revenue streams. And so you don't have to fight against other companies, and you can consolidate this parts manufacturing internationally into the countries that have the labor supply. So there's no reason for two people to be making solar panels. Just one person makes all of the solar panels most efficiently and gets all of the parts for the cheapest they can, and more solar panels as a whole get made, and more people get on solar and less people on oil and coal. Pretty simple argument, I think. Before I move on, I'll take OO very, very quickly. Go, OO.
Yep, so you're right. China does produce a lot of solar panels and EVs because they generate revenue. But given climate change doesn't immediately and directly threaten China's economic interests, wouldn't China prioritize cementing control over global semiconductor trade over climate change?
No, I mean, I got to be honest too. I think China would rather not everybody in the country die than manage to crunch a little tiny bit of revenue. I think the way people characterize China is honestly a little insulting in these kinds of rounds. They're not a bunch of evil, greedy people, man. They do care, and they don't want to see everybody die just like anybody else. Lastly, let's weigh this out. I think if you compare us to opening government, our framing clearly has a wider margin here, right? Because obviously, there's not as much agreement on labor protections. States still want cheap goods selfishly, so they probably are okay with exploiting poor countries. And honestly, if they do exploit poor countries, I mean, it does suck, and I understand what they're talking about. But obviously, more people, more little kids are going to die from climate change than are going to die from these mines in the Congo. So if you have to exploit some people in order to get those goods for cheap to make other things happen, I'm willing to bite that trade-off. Obviously, there's a larger scope. I mean, biodiversity loss, the heat, climate refugees, loss of agriculture, all of this kind of stuff is just obviously massive in scale. So I think we win quite clearly.
Thank you for that speech. Calling upon members of opposition. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, on my next word. I think the problem with this debate so far is there hasn't been significant contextualization as to what these countries want, and most of the countries located outside of the West and Russia and China and so forth are actively already thinking about most of these problems. What do I mean by that? Climate change is an existential threat, yes, but this also means that there is already present a sense of regional urgency. This means that countries by themselves, given the absence of an international organization, are already moving towards introducing policies that might be more environmental friendly, that might care more for green energy, and that might care more for things like water and mineral mining and so on and so forth. The reason this contextualization is important is it takes away the need that's present at both opening government and closing government because of the fact that these countries by themselves already have a sense of regional urgency that's propelling them to make good decisions. Why do we think the international body doesn't work? I think opening opposition has a fair point in terms of China in and of itself having a lot of control, but I think we're going to move beyond that. The point is, yes, you do have the fiat to assume the international organization has been created, but there are structural reasons as to why it gets worse on their side. First, I think there's a heavy policy bias, right? In terms of producing a one size fits all policy, which is effectively going to curtail most states and their development and going to lead them to want to back out of this policy in the first place. This means that there's a natural tendency for international organizations such as the IMF, as they mentioned, to make standardized policies that effectively apply to all countries regardless of what context and whatever needs they have. This means that yes, South Sudan may have different needs and perhaps may require different mining methods, but they're still going to have to be mined the same way that you're perhaps mining other nations in general. And the reason you're perhaps not going to perhaps include every single different context is because of the fact that these international institutions have significant degrees of policy bias in general. But I think there's also a collective action problem in terms of states, and once they're being forced to join this particular international organization. And I use the word forced here because of the fact that it's almost always going to be coercive in terms of the fact that given that most countries are coerced into joining it in the first place means that you don't want to be the person who's left out, right? But secondly, you can consistently feel that the organization in and of itself is a threat to you directly. What does this mean? This means that individually, countries may be a part of the international organization, but they're still less likely to be good members in terms of wanting to be active participants within the organization itself. This is important in terms of also perhaps the idea of just countries engaging in good policy making or perhaps just good treaty making in general. Thirdly, I think it's also important to mention that going beyond just the fact that China controls everything, even if we believe everything that OG says about how, the Western powers keeping them in check and China and Russia and the US working together, I think it's important to mention that the possibility of collusion always does exist, especially on the Western side. So and I'm going to CG here because of the fact that their entire extension is that we're going to repurpose all of these minerals and all of this technology and put it towards either producing green technology or through making companies do these things. Right? This means that the objectives that are determined are often determined outside of these countries themselves. And of course, even in the unlikely scenario that Russia, China, and the US actively agree on things, it's going to be important that they don't take into account this metrics that are often put forward by developing nations or by nations that are actively perhaps less powerful. Therefore, meaning that yes, if even if there are profits or perhaps good results to be garnered from this particular organization in and of itself, it's going to be limited to these particular nations. But we're going to go beyond opposition and actively give you a counterfactual. And this counterfactual is going to focus on regional cooperation and why it's better for three structural reasons. But before that, opening, if you have a viewer.
Sure. So your argument is countries will regulate themselves. The problem with this is even one actor says they don't want to. Now you have pit mines because everyone buys from that country, be it Kazakhstan or Congo. You have a high bar.
Could you repeat that? Of course, I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, sure. So even one country, be it Kazakhstan or Congo, decides they want to produce minerals cheaply and unethically, everyone will buy from them. You have to prove that no country does this.
Okay, first off, I'm going to answer this in the counterfactual, right? The fact is, regional cooperation, and I'm going to be the first person to say this, isn't perfect, but it's much better than the International Organization for four reasons, now given PUI. First, in response to the PUI, most individual countries don't have all the minerals necessary to function. Therefore, meaning they're of course going to trade with other countries. Therefore, meaning at this point, the bargaining power that can be exercised by countries in regards to direct trading often operates as a bar towards just individual countries taking unitary arbitrary decisions that effectively hurt everyone. Secondly, it's also important to realize perhaps the voluntary nature of these treaties in general. You know the specific agreements that you've agreed to. You know perhaps the intricacies of the trade that's necessary at this point for a particular moment in time. And regional cooperation, despite everything, is not the coercive, forceful mechanism that the international organization is. Meaning states are much more likely to opt into it, but also it's just optically better, meaning states are more willing to perhaps compromise on certain things and certain other policies. Third, it's also perceived better compared to perhaps the resource curse in terms of the international organization in general. Because most people fear the international organization because of the fact that it's institutional. Therefore, meaning that it's going to be much more dangerous if it starts to impede your sovereignty or perhaps indulges in perhaps things like political instability. And this naturally lays down the precedent, which it naturally lays down the precedent that the resource management in general is perhaps enough of a ground to impede on countries' sovereignty. Therefore, meaning it's not going to just stop at their minerals in general. It's also can translate to other resources, which means that individuals can, or perhaps conservatives or right wingers, can use this as an incendiary narrative against the state in and of itself. So for all those reasons, closing opposition.
Thank you for that speech. Calling upon government with here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Great. I think it's pretty difficult to curry favor from all the countries in the world to kind of do a single thing. And so OO has some pretty simple pushes of to say China is probably going to oppose this idea that maybe does to some degree trample on their ability to continue to be the world's monopoly. And I think this is maybe a reasonable take. However, we have two responses to this that I don't think are reasonably challenged by OO nor extended by CO. The first is to say that states are likely going to agree on something as international as climate change because it affects every country, maybe not equally within the short term, but eventually we're all going to die if we don't deal with this issue. So it's to say that the international body comes into existence because all the relevant actors agree on the idea of climate change getting better. So when they all care about this particular thing, it's to say that these types of international bodies are able to form successfully. The reason why China won't have a stranglehold then on these types of things is because the opt-in mechanisms necessary for all these other countries to join are necessarily going to hold China accountable. Because China might be the biggest player when it comes to this type of stuff within this body, but these bodies tend to be politicized and they tend to have economic implications in other areas. And China isn't going to be dominant in all of these other sectors, especially when compared to the rest of the world. So it's likely we're going to have these types of accountability mechanisms. But secondly, I think China monopolizing and producing solar panels is just kind of fine. Like if America keeps on buying them, this is just okay. Our case fits into this very well. We tell you that if climate change is an existential threat, and every country is willing to agree that it is an existential threat, we're able to better regulate the types of industries which participate within these things. And so we say, currently the reason we're dealing with climate change so slowly is because there's a lot of companies that are kind of driving up the price of these types of rare earth minerals and making these types of things difficult for companies that are actually doing good for the world to actually be able to purchase. So we say we're able to regulate down these types of companies, perhaps setting different price incentives, or like, I don't know, just controlling the supply chain through which these things flow to make sure that it's a significantly less volatile purchase when there are EV companies that are trying to buy these things, to make sure the first dibs on access to these goods. And that's how we reach the impact of these companies being able to scale significantly faster in the long term, because understanding that you're going to have fair supply in the future, practically giving them monopsony power, obviously not giving them like leverage under this monopsony power because you have an international body that regulates all of these things, is probably just a very, very quick way to make sure that these industries are able to develop quickly. We tell you there's a bunch of reasons as well for why it is that these types of companies are going to cooperate well. Firstly, we say that the international body just can create much more fluid and efficient supply chains. And the reason this is successful is because they service completely different EV needs, right? So think BYD services a completely different market than what Tesla is able to service. So they're likely not going to be competing against each other. And more of all, just kind of working in like not the type of monopolistic collaboration you would see between two companies that are selling to the same market, but two companies selling to different markets, willing to concede on pricing, especially when they're buying rare earth minerals. Secondly, EV manufacturers don't have much more leverage than the supply chain. And given the supply chain is controlled by the international bodies, these companies can be effectively regulated. I'm going to weigh these claims first off against OG, and then I'll go conclusively take out OO and CO. So OG runs similar mechanisms, but I think in a different light, where they talk about solving ethical issues. And somehow having global leverage is going to solve these issues because China does less child labor stuff than all these other countries like the DRC. I agree that this is probably true. OG gave us mechanisms to believe this is the case. I'm just not so sure how big the delta is. Like China does questionable things, obviously. I think a lot of countries do questionable things. But two ways this doesn't actually solve the problem is China will continue to do those questionable things irregardless of whether or not the rest of the world is doing it. Maybe you improve the issue specifically of child labor in resource extraction, but I don't think that this necessarily changes child labor in general within these developing countries, which is the second issue, right? In the developing country, like say like DRC, the child laborers aren't going anywhere. The market for child laborers has just kind of changed because instead of working for REM, there's now just a bunch of free labor, or like I guess lower priced labor on the market. So presumably there will just be other industries that previously were hiring more ethically and now continue to hire child laborers because the price on child labor has just decreased. So I'm not really sure what problem OG is solving. They definitely proved their case. I'm not sure why we should specifically care about child labor decreasing in these areas, because that doesn't solve the ethical implications of everything else. Secondly, I think that our impact on the environment is just significantly greater than OG. All they end up being able to prove is that you develop these mines in maybe safer ways. What we're able to show is that you conclusively are able to at least reduce the rate at which climate change is occurring, saving millions of lives. I'll take O in like 20 seconds. The second thing I want to weigh is just developing country child labor, right? More people are going to die from climate change than child labor in the Congo, which is, I don't know, it's pretty sad, but like, it's just true. So when we're weighing the scope of our cases, we're also beating OG on that. I'll take a point.
Yep, so I agree that OG doesn't solve child labor. I also want to point out that OO clearly supported bilateral trade as our counterfactual, which is also the status quo. CEO's counterfactual and regional cooperation opened themselves up to the same criticism of China's influence, either internally or externally, of such things.
I don't think bilateral trade is able to solve like environmental issues. Like you don't propel the production of different goods just because you have bilateral trade. Because notably, when you have bilateral trade, EV companies outside of the countries that do the bilateral trade, who perhaps don't have like domestic production of the resources, aren't able to access the wealth of resources that happen in the bilateral trade. So like say, I don't know, like Tesla, like America doesn't produce a lot of rare earth minerals. If America like needed to suddenly access these rare earth minerals, it becomes way higher of a ceiling to be able to actually access these minerals if they have to deal with now the lithium triangle between Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, because they're able to spike their prices higher given that they have such a humongous supply of all of these things. They're able to monopolize on these types of things. So bilateral trade doesn't solve these issues, especially if you're not able to formulate these deals in the first place. Anyway, responding to CO, they say regional cooperation is better. They said they have 4 reasons. I only heard 2. First, they say most individual countries don't have the minerals necessary to function. I think international bodies are better at controlling these things. Next, they say regional cooperation is easier for states to opt into. This makes absolutely no sense. It's difficult for states to opt into regional cooperation because there's a lot of political alignment which is involved in these things. So say you join this particular bloc which only trades with the US, but you're also trying to like make your way into BRICS because it accesses a humongous market control for you. Now it's really difficult to make this decision of who you want to trade with. So I think regional cooperation probably doesn't always happen in good ways. It happens in ways that allows you to monopolize. It's susceptible to our case. It falls. I think we are winning this round. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that speech. Calling upon opposition view. Here.
Am I clearly visible and audible?
Yep.
Cool. Let me check my chat in a second. Opening government says that because this international organization involves all the major trade players in the world, namely China, Russia, and the US, they're going to contest with each other. And because they exist in competition, this is likely to going to lead to accountability between the major trade powers. And this is how opening government unlocks their impact. Closing government differs from this and say, well, obviously, these are contesting and competing trade powers, but there must be something that they must agree on which basis they choose to collaborate, on which basis they choose to collude. We at closing opposition think that closing government is probably right in their logic, that not all countries are inherently unequal and competitive to the point that it is damning to their own economy, to their own economies and survival. But we think closing government's denominator that they chose, that this is the common denominator on which these major countries agree on. We think that denominator is wrong. We think it is likely to be profit, and that defeats all of opening governments and closing governments' impact. Closing opposition will then proves to you why regional cooperation and bilateral trade is better off in reaching those same impacts. I would like to go with this step by step. In the instance that these countries are going to collude and collaborate, why is their highest priority and concern not going to solve climate change, but continue investing this into either luxury tech or using this to enhance already existing and they will instead use this to basically funnel all of these rare elements into existing luxury tech. We think the problem with green tech is that closing government assume that these countries are just there's no intermediary or there's no external force acting on the governments of these countries, that they're just the very honest and innocent representatives representatives of the civilians of these countries, that there is no lobbying power acting on them. I would like to point out that the same countries that closing government names, for instance, Namibia, and many more, which have like billions of dollars of stake in this tech, which is sure non-essential, but they have billions of dollars of stake. These are the exact companies which basically finance the campaigns of many US politicians, which are then inherently, because their campaigns are stronger, are also likely to win the elections and decide policies. This means that it is against their own political self-interest to basically even think about solving climate change or think about funneling or redirecting these rare earth elements into creating green tech in the first place. But let's assume, closing government best case, in the instant that they are the best representatives of their civilians, we think still there's a problem, because there's a large amount of push, even in countries like USA, against doing against opting too much wholeheartedly into preventative policies against climate change and to investing in green tech, because this poses a huge employment risk and in the opinion of the Republican Party, a huge resource waste as well if they try to commit to any climate change agreements. For instance, the last time Trump was in power, he backed out of the Paris Accord. Trump is likely to be in power again. We think it is false of closing government to assume that all countries, by virtue of a survival instinct, are likely to be interested in solving climate change. We think they forget the fact that many countries actually don't even think this to be a problem in the first place. Yes, this is unfortunate, but we think this is the political reality that closing government has to deal with. Then we think, in the instant that these governments are instead being lobbied, being lobbied by big oil, being lobbied by huge fossil fuel conglomerates, it is likely that they will not invest this in green tech and let the investment and the funneling of these rare earth elements go into the same luxury, like non-essential tech that closing government talks about. Hence, this don't get to solve the problems of climate change on their side of the house. I would like to note that in the instant that these companies are under the influence of the fossil fuel industry and lobbying from big tech, it is likely to be the case that opening government's impacts are also largely mitigated, because often these companies are, by the way, important point to note, many of these, like the utilization of these resources, is not done by nationalized industries or these governments themselves, but by multinational conglomerates. And many of the multinational conglomerates which are lobbying these governments are basically the same. So yes, closing government is correct in pointing out that they're likely to collude and collaborate, but they collude and collaborate on keeping the profits. What drives down the profits? Labor exploitation drives down the profits. This means that the opening government's impact of labor regulation are very unlikely in the instant that these companies realize that there's a mutual game theory incentive in order to drive the price drive the price of production down, because all of them collectively benefit from it and no one calls out on each other. Comparatively, when international organization doesn't exist, it is far more likely that these countries are motivated to call out each other and keep accountability on each other when you do not conjoin them and let them basically act like a cartel. We think, last response to closing government I would like to note here is that if it is true that climate change is such a pressing issue and all of the incentive analysis is to be believed, then we really don't see the utility of an international organization being there in place. Yes, there may be some bureaucratic and clerical benefit, but we don't think that is something that justifies creating an international organization with significant and uncertain risk in the future. If they do think climate change is a problem and they do want to invest their rare earth elements into doing this, they can just do it. They can just do it without the existence of an international organization. Closing government's case isn't exclusive here. I'll take a point from opening government.
Sure. So governments have minimal rights. This means that US politicians, for example, internalize the profits they make from enabling mining in the US, which is way more money than they get from lobbying. This is billions of dollars.
But that money goes into the economy. Lobbying goes into the pockets of politicians. If politicians had to choose, they would much rather let the money go into their retirement and saving banks than to the general economy. Lastly, then, we think at closing opposition, we have a solid comparative that is much better than the comparative, more fleshed out by the comparative than presented by opening opposition. We tell you that regional cooperation is a real thing that is not up to exploitation and breaches of sovereignty. Because closing opposition 1 told you that in the instant that international organization is created, and in both government teams' best case, this is going to be an international organization which does not respect the sovereignty of the country of, let's say, the Central African Republic or Chad or Congo, i.e., which decisions to take, how much to resource extract and how much not to resource extract. This is a massive breach of sovereignty on part of that against these politically vulnerable nations, and not just like a breach of sovereignty. We think this likely creates political instability as well, because selling these or rare earth elements is the only source of some sort of economic prosperity for these countries. In regional cooperation and bilateral trade, these countries get the agency to choose their partners. For instance, and in this instance, even the global countries from global south have the ability to participate or establish trade relations with these countries because they have some trade specialization to propose. On government teams, best case, only US, China, and Russia get access to these mining rights in the first place. Wood closing opposition.
Thank you for that speech. With that conclude the round, I would like to invite everyone to virtually cross the floor.